Thank you very much. Secretary Lehman.
Thank you. Mr. Steinberg, I found your testimony very compelling and goes right to the heart of the issues. I'd like to start by which is better. I would like to start by asking your views about the role of the National Security Council, because, as you know, it was envisioned to solve all of the problems that we're worrying about here. It was supposed to have the ability to coordinate differing views on priorities, on budgets, and to resolve differences between the cabinet barons. In my own limited experience on the NSC staff, I found that it worked pretty well doing that, particularly on issues of priorities on intelligence. There was a thing called the 40 Committee where differences of views between state, defense, and individual elements of the intelligence community were resolved, and money moved against the wishes of certain of the players around the table. And they came to every meeting because if they didn't, they knew Kissinger would move the money anyway. So it functioned pretty well. And what in the intervening time between the establishment of the NSC and its initial implementation by President Truman, which was very different than what Forrestal had intended, what's gone wrong? Why is that mechanism no longer sufficient to resolve these kinds of budgetary priority targeting and personnel issues?
I think you've raised a very important question, and I think the answer is that within its traditional ambit, I think the NSC still does work well. There is a community that is part of the NSC community, the traditional one, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Director of the CIA, the Secretary of State, occasionally the Secretary of the Treasury, who are familiar with the system, work within the system. But what we found moving into the 1990s with these new set of challenges, which were very different than dealing with a foreign state adversary, was that there were a set of actors who didn't function within the ambit of the NSC system. The most important was the Justice Department and particularly the FBI. And for the reasons that we've been discussing this morning, there was a deep reluctance to submit the FBI to the overall responsibilities of the NSC. Questions about the role of the White House, questions about whether the independence of the law enforcement function would be compromised. And while there were considerable discussions throughout President Clinton's term about trying to reconcile these differences, we were unable to reach an agreement that was comfortable on both sides and had the imprimatur of the broader support that would be needed, I think, to make those kinds of changes. And this similarly was true with respect to aspects of the economic and domestic policy system, which were not traditionally part of the NSC. And so I think that the basic model that you described can work and can work very effectively, but we need to rethink what that community is and who ought to be part of it. And one of the reasons why I believe, along with Director Deutsch, that we do want to separate the law enforcement and the domestic security function is that I think it will remain uncomfortable to bring the FBI in its law enforcement capacity under the NSC system. But it's imperative that we bring this domestic counterintelligence and counterterrorism function into that system and integrate it with what we're doing. So I think that's why I would favor basically returning the NSC to its traditional role, but with a new concept of what national security is about. If that is the function, and we understand the national security challenge to be different than the challenge of dealing with the Soviet Union or with foreign states, then we want to think about the composition and the interaction among the agencies in a different way.
So how would we structure the role of a DNI or DCI along the lines you're recommending into that NSC structure? I mean, there always has been one national security advisor. Now, in effect, there'd be two. How would you divide the functions of a DNI, a DCI, and the NSC, the National Security Advisor? And of course, I'm presuming that you're not recommending that a DCI enhanced or DNI be a member of the cabinet.
That's correct. I think that I don't think there'd be two national security advisors, because I think that the DNI would still be providing intelligence input into a policy process, and in effect an advisor to the NSC system rather than a member of the NSC system. I think that I have, in my testimony, not wandered into the perilous grounds that John Deutsch did about the relationship between the DNI and the Secretary of Defense. He knows it better than I do. I've certainly observed it, and I think that both points that he made about some desirability and the points that you've made about the practicality are both real. But where I think where the key issue now is for domestic security is this question about the role of either the DCI or the DNI over domestic intelligence collection and analysis, over which now he does not have appropriate authority. So I don't see this as a significant change of the role of either the DNI or the DCI in the NSC system. I do think it is an expansion of the role with respect to counterterrorism intelligence collection and analysis within the United States and vis-a-vis U.S. persons, where his responsibility would be functionally the same, but would cover a broader set of activities.
Thank you. There are people who believe that the greater blame in intelligence failures over 9/11 lies not necessarily with the intelligence community, but with the lack of the proper prioritizing given by senior political decision makers. And this is part of a larger issue that's always been debated about should the policymaker take a much more active role in directing the priorities of what is to be collected and direct the intelligence community to find a way to collect it, rather than taking a more passive role and saying, okay, tell me what's happening, giving no priorities as to what hypotheses should be collected against. And I think in the reading of recent post-World War II history, that's a pretty strong case that the intelligence community has not been given the kinds of priorities of targeting and the hypotheses to collect against that would have made their focus and their collection and analysis much more effective. In your time as Deputy National Security Advisor, was there an effective prioritizing of the assets, or was it more driven by capabilities? We have these wonderful satellites that can count things, so let's count camps. And if we can't count camps, then they don't exist, sort of thing. Would you comment on that?
It's a very good question. I think during the time that I was in the White House, we began to move in a direction that increased the role of the policy community in setting priorities. I'll not remember the name of that number of that PDD, but we instituted a process by which there was a formal involvement of the policy community in identifying collection and analysis priorities, which was then fed into the director's own tasking responsibilities. And I say it was a formal process. It was led by the NSC and the Directorate of Intelligence to, in effect, solicit from the policy agencies and to develop a ranking or categories of ranking of different levels of priority, which were then to be turned into tasking. I would say it was a step in the right direction, but I do agree with you that the policy community is ultimately responsible for setting those priorities, that the director can provide advice based on what the intelligence community sees as the threats, but the policy community is ultimately accountable for those allocation of resources and for protecting the national security. So what I think we need to do is to take that one step further, which is to make sure that that input, which the policy community now provides, is actually reflected in the decisions that are made by the tasking done by the DCI and the Secretary of Defense, and that there is a feedback loop in that so that those decisions are, again, reviewed in a timely and effective way to make sure that the policy community is not only having a chance to say in the front end what it thinks the priorities are, but really meaningfully engage with the results that come out of that process when those general priorities are translated into actual operational allocations of resources.
I have two more questions related. Jim Schlesinger earlier testified that much more important than moving around the blocks on the chart are recruiting and supporting the right kinds of people. And I'd like to get your views on what kind of people are we recruiting? And I'm more now talking about analysis than the operational side. First, at the top, what kind of person should be the CIA director? And then at the analytical level, are we recruiting? I mean, Kissinger used to say that one of the problems with CIA analysis is the way they recruit people. They can have nothing in their past and hence can have nothing in their future. That's obviously not very fair, but the point of self-recruiting is true in any bureaucracy. You end up with the same round pebbles, smooth and edgeless, and so what they produce is smooth and edgeless. The related second question is how, in that kind of a community, and in the community you now want to centralize under a DNI, do you keep diversity and competition of hypotheses and of interpretation?
On your first question, the leadership, it's hard to make a broad statement because you really depend on very uniquely qualified special individuals, and we've had a couple of them here today. I think what we've seen from both of the previous speakers is that individuals who've had experience both in the analytic world and the policy world, I think, tend to make good directors of Central Intelligence simply because they understand the policy process and how intelligence and information fits into it. But they need strong analytic backgrounds of their own so that they're not simply translating the policymakers' process in. And I think if you look at the history of recent directors, we've had a number of enormously talented people. The more important question in terms of trying to figure out a process is the one that you've raised, which is who do we bring in? And I think I'd make a couple of points about that. First, we do need diversity. And while I believe that we need a director of national intelligence, I don't think we should get rid of all of the intelligence, the components of the intelligence community. I served in INR at the beginning of the Clinton administration and have enormous respect both for the analysts there and for the fact that there is an intelligence component which is closely connected to the State Department, because I think it brings insights and perspective into the broader intelligence community that would be absent. And if it were really centralized, as had been proposed a number of years, to have one intelligence community. And I think the same is true about DIA and other components, the service intelligence components and the like. So I'm not for creating a single entity to do the analysis. I think there should be somebody who's responsible overall for that. The INR experience is instructive because one of the things that brings strength to the INR analysts is many of them have served as Foreign Service officers in foreign posts. And there's a tendency, for exactly the reasons that you said, in the core parts of the intelligence community, and particularly in the analytic part of the CIA, to be leery of people who've ever been anywhere and who may have been part of those things. They want people who come in from university, who have strong educational backgrounds, but who can sort of make sure that there aren't any risks. And so what happens is that they tend to be very strong, analytically trained, but not a lot of experience in the world. And then once they become part of the community, it's even harder to send them out because of fears of compromise and the like. And so they don't rotate out into the field. And while there's clearly a place for strong academically trained individuals, I think we need to have a much more diverse sense of who we want to bring in. People from the business community who offer enormous insights into these problems. People from different walks of life, from religious communities and like, missionary groups who've been abroad. And sometimes they won't be people you want to have full-time on the intelligence community staff. But we need to have a much more diverse array of expertise. We need to let people in the analytic community get out into the world some. Let them serve with state and local governments if we're dealing with counterterrorism, to see the perspective from the cop on the beat or the public health worker. I think it's that sense of, rather than having a very cabined-off community, that fits in with my broader sense of what the more decentralized, more open sense of what the intelligence community ought to consist of.
Thank you.
Commissioner Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and nice to see you again. And on behalf of the Commission, we all thank you for your valuable and very capable public service throughout the 1990s. I want to ask, as somebody who was there, as somebody who was on the National Security Council during the 1990s, that there was an important event that the Joint Inquiry looked at and that we will certainly look at on this commission, when in December of 1998, the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, issued a memorandum to senior CIA managers, the Deputy DCI and others, and he said this, and I quote, he said, "We must now enter a new phase in our effort against bin Laden. We are at war. I want no resources or people spared in this effort, either inside the CIA or the community, unquote. Now, despite his exclamation there, or his memorandums, the joint inquiry concluded that the intelligence community was not on a war footing prior to September 11th. Do you agree with that? And if not, why not?
I think you have to look at the period during the 1990s in an evolutionary way. I think that throughout the period, there was a growing and growing sense of the urgency and the priority that needed to be given to the counterterrorism task, and particularly the specific threat that al-Qaeda represented. I cited in my testimony some statements from the President in the mid-1990s. I think there was a clear awareness of this being of growing importance, and certainly by the time of the bombings in August of 1998 on our embassies, about the absolute first priority. And I can tell you, having had a chance to watch Mr. Berger close up, that this was by far and away, without even a shadow of a close second, his most dominant priority. As I said, growing throughout the 1990s, but certainly following the August 98 bombings, it was the first thing he worried about every day and the last thing he worried about every night before he went home, which was never very often. And I think that the memorandum that you identified reflected the fact that, particularly in the CIA, which was dealing with what was most known about al-Qaeda and its operations, that is, its overseas activities, that at least what I saw, which is in the senior levels of the CIA, a real appreciation of just how important and how urgent this was. And frankly, I think if you look at what took place in the period post-1998, and you obviously will have access to the details, and there's some that I can't go into in specifics here, there was an enormous amount of activity that led to significant disruptions of terrorist cells in a number of countries abroad. So I mentioned in my testimony the significant activity that took place in the run-up to the millennium, some of it from just the outstanding casework by officers, some by alert border agents, and all the kinds of things, the combination of both good work and good luck that you need to have in these things. So I think there was clearly a movement in that direction, and it's obviously, I think we would all say in retrospect, that more could be done, that there were aspects of the community that resisted change, that there's enormous inertia. And I think there was a fundamental problem on the domestic side, because it was simply outside the ambit of what we had any authority over. There was a very, very thick wall between the NSC process in the White House and domestic-related activities that involved the Justice Department and the FBI. And for the reasons we discussed, there were good reasons for aspects of that, but it created a system that made it harder to integrate the overall effort.
Given the fact that it was the DCI and it was a memorandum, a piece of paper, and given that former DCI Deutsch said that he thought that responsibility should go to the National Security Council, in retrospect, should there have been something else coming, especially after 1998 and the embassy bombings? Should it have elevated to a different set of actors? Should it have been through a different set of policy directives? What might have changed this from, as you stated, an evolutionary status to a war footing?
Well, I think if you look at the activities of the NSC principles in the post-August 1998 period, you would see something that looked pretty much like a war footing. And particularly in the period in 1999, as we became concerned with the millennium, there were practically daily conversations by the NSC principals about this problem. And certainly in the fall of 1999, there were daily and sometimes multiple times a day meetings of the NSC principals about this. So I think at the highest levels, there was a recognition that this was a challenge, the likes of which we had not seen in a very long time, because even during the height of the Cold War, this was not a kind of a tactical day-to-day crisis, with the exception of periods like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin Crisis. So people understood that. I think that the problems were with changing the way the system as a whole worked, as opposed to what individual cabinet members and sort of principal deputies were doing, was that we hadn't thoroughly, taken apart the system. What we did was to create a focus at the NSC, both through the National Security Advisor and through the Director of Counterterrorism, who I think did an extraordinary job. And I think, as many of you know, I think Dick Clark was an enormous civil servant who provided a considerable amount of energy and drive and direction to that. But I think that what is clear, and clearly what I've advocated here is that we tried to work it through an existing system. We made changes in PDD 62, but we still relied on the lead agency concept, and we still weren't able to deal with the two barriers that I talked about, which was the divide between foreign and domestic and the divide between law enforcement and intelligence. We had endless discussions with the FBI and the Justice Department about how to solve these problems. But without, I think, direction not only from the President, but also from Congress and from leading voices such as the Commission, I think that the public support for the kind of changes that are needed now is possible. But that's why we have to, I think, have the kind of leadership that you all can show in making that happen.
Given what you learned in the National Security Council during the 1990s, and given the fact that you said you learned more and more, especially after the African bombings, especially after the Millennium Threat, what specifically did you tell the Bush administration when they came into office about how to organize the National Security Council so that it could respond quickly in a transition period to this imminent threat?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I know that Mr. Berger had extensive conversations with him as well, but since I've also talked about this in some of my public writing since then, I think I can feel comfortable in saying it, which is that I felt very strongly that the counterterrorism and the law enforcement intelligence connection needed to be brought explicitly into the NSC process. I wrote a short op-ed in the Washington Post in January of 2001 suggesting one model to do that, because I think the thing that struck me most clearly was the fact that we were very much hampered by this divide, and that this was something that the NSC had to get a hold of, that we could not simply allow that piece of what is crucial to our security to be held at arm's length from the most effective process of integrating these functions. And that I thought that while the President would need to have independent advice from the agencies, that there needed to be a stronger role from the NSC to integrate all of those aspects. And it goes beyond the law enforcement intelligence function. I also felt there was a need to integrate better the economic and sort of political security side of our work, because we're living in a seamless world where these lines that we've built up over the years that have been mirrored in the bureaucratic institutions that we've created simply don't correspond to what we now have to deal with. And that in order to have accountability for these things, we needed to have a place in which all of these pieces came together rather than through separate stovepipes up to the President, who obviously ultimately has all the accountability, but who can't really manage it unless he's got a process that can help integrate these things better.
And finally, Mr. Steinberg, you've been very helpful. When I was on the joint inquiry, we expressed our concern about getting access to the presidential decision briefs. I think they're important for two reasons. One, because not only do they inform the President about, and other policymakers about what intelligence they've gathered from different kinds of sources and methods, but what the threat might be. But maybe even more importantly, how a certain group of people in the bureaucracy and the organization are able to put information together to inform and advise and warn policymakers. So it's very, very important, I think, as informative to policymakers, informative about the bureaucracy. What do you feel about PDBs?
Well, I think there's certainly a very strong reason why, first, the dissemination of the PDB is very small, and that the President and the executive branch has been very reluctant to share that more broadly, and I think that's appropriate. I think it is an important fact itself as to what the President and his advisors are focusing on, in addition to the fact that, as you well know, some of the most sensitive information available to advisors is in that in ways that are just not available in almost any other intelligence product.
Including the SEABs.
Including the SEABs, absolutely. I do believe in the unique case that you are facing here, when we really need to think about this process, and we're being asked to make such core and critical decisions about the future of the way we do business to deal with this new threat, that it is appropriate for the Commission to have access to this. But I take that on the basis that the Commission, will treat it as a very special exercise, and one in which, with a sensitivity to why it is, as a general matter, that the PDB should not be generally available, because I think otherwise we would just undercut the PDB as the instrument that it needs to be of dealing with the way the President and his very most senior advisors learn about the things that are most important to their job.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner Gorelick?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Steinberg, for being here and for your very helpful testimony. I would like to follow up very briefly on Commissioner Lehman's questions to you about priority setting and Commissioner Romer's question to you about the operational role of the National Security Council. You had it was PDD 35, the PDD 35 process, the ability to set priorities across the government for the collection of intelligence. But as you just described with regard to the millennium, when you had warning that something was going to occur or might occur, the NSC had the ability to surge, to bring everyone to the table many times a week, often many times a day, to break through the barriers among the different agencies, including the big barrier that you have adverted to, the barrier between domestic and foreign intelligence. So this is my question to you. Absent the kind of structural reform that you have suggested and others have suggested, where you literally tear down the wall between domestic and foreign collection and put someone in control of both, what is the role of the National Security Council in breaking through those barriers in a period of heightened warning, as we had when Director Tenet made his statements in February of '01 that we're in a crisis period and need to be at our most wary? What is the proper role of the National Security Council in those circumstances?
I think that to think about it, you have to think about the two different roles that the NSC generally plays, which is one, the overall sort of policy coordination and policy setting process, and the other is what I would call a crisis management function. Both of them are critical, but they're very different. The policy-making process is a deliberative process. It tries to set long-term goals and priorities, tries to look at, how you meld the different claims on time and resources, and tries to think forward in a proactive way about what needs to be done. It brings everybody to the table, but and the debates are important, and they provide guidance for the decisions that agencies are going to make and to reconcile conflicting claims. But inevitably, those things don't touch on the operational side, and for the day-to-day operations, we do rely on the agencies. One of the reasons why I think where we are now, I believe we should strengthen the role of the Secretary of DHS is because I think for many of the day-to-day responsibilities of Homeland Security, it would be important to have a cabinet-level operational official who is accountable and responsible for these set of activities, and that responsibility should not reside at the NSC. However, for crisis management, and this is as true for dealing with crises abroad as it is with this particular crisis, there are times in which you need to accelerate and intensify the focus of actors around a problem that requires high-level decisions and doing not business as usual. However good the business as usual is, and business as usual can be quite good. I'm not meaning to disparage it. And there is a function there in which the NSC process continues to focus attention and make sure that timely information is brought to the table, decisions are being made in a timely way, and there's an ability to review the way those decisions are being implemented. But just as though we've talked about this as being a war, this is not an acute war. It has acute phases where we have particularly heightened periods of warning. But it is simply unsustainable to think that we're going to solve the problem by having the NSC principals meet every day to deal with this challenge. There are other things they have to do, and we need to build a system that can embody, as part of its business as usual, a better way of handling this, understanding that in periods of crisis we're going to have to surge and use this mechanism of crisis management in the NSC to deal with these extremely heightened periods.
So if you were still Deputy National Security Advisor, I take it your advice on structure within the White House, obviously acknowledging that the structure within the White House is the prerogative of any individual president and has to mirror the way that person and his key advisors feel comfortable operating. But you would bring within the ambit of the National Security Council the Department of Homeland Security and the domestic intelligence capacities of the FBI, whether it's as the FBI or as some new entity. And I take it then you would not have a competing additional Homeland Security Council. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think that, I think the problem right now is we've ended up with what is arguably the worst of both worlds, which is I think it was possible to say at the beginning that we're going to have a very strong Homeland Security Council and a Homeland Security Advisor who has the same role, clout, responsibilities that the National Security Advisor did. There'd be problems about the foreign and domestic scene, but you'd at least have a strong and dynamic process. Under those circumstances, you would not have a strong Secretary of Homeland Security. Alternatively, we could have a strong Secretary of Homeland Security who has large responsibilities for all the domestic functions, both within his agency and the broader domestic community, and then the NSC to bridge that gap. I think given the fact we've now created DHS, that latter model is the better model. It allows some of the domestic functions, which the NSC is not particularly connected to, particularly the FEMA-type connections, not to be something that the NSC has to worry about day to day, but allows us to both get the strength of an executive agency with implementation capability in a strong Secretary of Homeland Security, and the coordination across the foreign domestic scene through the NSC with the deputy, as exists now and very capably handled by Fran Townsend, who has a full-time responsibility for this job.
Thank you for those clear and incisive answers.
Senator Gordon.
On the 7th page of your written testimony, Jim, I think in one paragraph, you summarize as cogently as I've ever seen it, the case against combining law enforcement with these preventive activities in the FBI. And that, of course, you have many allies, at least outside of the FBI and the Department of Justice. But you go on to say, it's for the reasons that you outlined, that a separate domestic security organization is needed for prevention, and then say that there are 3 possibilities for that agency: in justice but separated from the FBI, in the Department of Homeland Security, or as an independent agency. Unless that latter is an awfully broad definition, aren't there more than more than 3? Is it not at least conceivably possible, and I'd like your critique on it, to simply merge this function with the present CIA, or to do what John Deutsch recommended, to have both the CIA and this domestic entity under a DCI, which I think that's sort of a modest DNI. It isn't as broad as your recommendations on it. He's backed off from that. And wouldn't either of those be a superior response or way to respond to this, because of this divorce, this present divorce between domestic intelligence and intelligence coming from overseas?
Maybe I wasn't clear enough in my written testimony. When I talk about an independent agency, I had in mind reporting to the DNI. I mean, not as something separate from the entire system. I meant independent only, that it would not be in any cabinet level agency. And so I completely agree with you.
Let's say, this DNI idea has been around for years, and the political objections to it from, or at least the policy objections to it from secretaries of defense, have always prevented it from being seriously considered. Even if we regarded a DNI as the ideal solution, my backup question to John Deutsch: would it not be an improvement to have it married more closely somehow or another with the CIA, even if we don't have an overall DNI?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. The only thing I would be careful about is I would not want to see this merged with the DO. I mean, I think that there is, just as there is an MI5 and an MI6, it's a slightly different model because it reports to the Home Secretary. I would not want I think it's important that the DO have its distinct functions from what this domestic intelligence service would be doing, and particularly in the collection function. But I have no problem in saying that the model that you've suggested, because the very fact of giving the DCI that authority creates a mini DNI, in my view. I mean, it creates a broader spectrum of integration over the whole counterterrorism function and the prevention function to the DCI. So whether we change the name or not, I think we've accomplished an important part of what needs to be done through the model that you've described.
Thank you, and thank you for a remarkable analysis.
Commissioner Benvenisti.
Good afternoon, almost. Mr. Steinberg, and thank you for coming. It's good to see you again. I would like to turn from the theoretical to the historical, as you have ample experience in both of those areas. Secretary Schlesinger today testified that, and I think it's consistent with the general public perception, that there was an insufficient sense of urgency in the intelligence community prior to 9/11 about the terrorist threat and particularly the potential for a domestic event. That seems contrary to the testimony which you have given here today, which indicates that there were frequent conversations at the highest level within the intelligence community about terrorist threats. And so can you explain whether there was some sort of disconnect once there was a change in administrations, or was there a communication of the sense of urgency which you have testified about as our administrations transitioned from one to the other?
I think one of the hardest things to do from somebody who has been inside and now is outside is to pretend that we know what was going on in an administration that you're not serving in. And so I'm very reluctant to make a judgment about what has been going on within the current administration. I think we all rely on second and third hand accounts, and I think we need to hear, and I would certainly be uncomfortable with making judgments until I'd heard more from the current administration itself. I want to go back to my main point, though, which is that I think that one of the problems, again, nobody disputes that one can always do more, and that in retrospect, post 9/11, there are things that one could say should have been done. Indisputably, that's true. But I want to convey the sense that there was a profound sense the change in the nature of the world and the absolute priority that the counterterrorism mission, and particularly the al-Qaeda threat, represented. I think one of the problems is that we could see at the NSC a lot about what the CIA was doing. We got briefed all the time. We had access to learning about what their activities were, both on the DO and the DI side. We had no transparency vis-a-vis the domestic side. There was a wall, and it was, as Ms. Gerlich said, the curtain was slightly raised during the millennium when the rules were kind of bent. But for the most part, that was not true. And so it's very hard for me to make a judgment, frankly, about how well things were being done on that side, because we didn't have oversight and were not thought appropriately to have oversight over that part of the process. I think that I think that what we have learned from that is the need to establish accountability somewhere in the system, so that when you say, well, was enough urgency given, were enough priority, you can say, here's where the responsibility lies. And I think that there are two dimensions to that. Where is the responsibility on the intelligence collection and analysis side, and where is that on the policy side? And I think the American people are entitled to know that, short of the president, who do we look to for these things? And we must structure ourselves in a way that creates the incentives, where somebody has their authority and their accountability match up. And you can say, yes, they had the ability to make the decisions, and if they didn't make them, then they're accountable. And if they did, then they deserve, the credit for what was done.
Perhaps I was imprecise in my question. Let me go about it in a more direct way. You indicate that there was a high sense of urgency in your administration, particularly as you got to the millennium, with respect to the terrorist threat. It was, as you have said, the #1 priority of the National Security Council. My question is whether that sense of urgency was communicated to the incoming administration?
I think undoubtedly, yes. I mean, indisputably, yes. That is, it was, you could not have been sitting where we were sitting and spending our day to day and trying to describe to our successors about what we were doing day to day and not have that be the priority, because it was in fact what we were doing. And it was transformative in terms of the way we did business, the focus that we had, and the activities that were the preoccupation of the most senior people, not only in the NSC, but in all senior levels.
Thank you.
Mr. Steinberg, thank you very much for your articulate testimony. We appreciate it very much. It's been extraordinarily helpful. We will take a break now. I would remind commission members we have a very important meeting now, so if you have any business to do, personal or otherwise, you can do it as fast as possible and join us in back for our meeting. Thank you very much. We'll reconvene at close to 1 o'clock as we can.